it's Jeff.
And it's John. And we are back at Love and Other Investments. And Jeff had an idea that maybe today we talk a little bit. We did an episode a little earlier on ADHD and kind of some thoughts on that. And then Jeff was thinking today maybe we could take a whack at trauma, although probably taking a whack is
probably not the best way to say that. It's all spontaneous. So,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think I want to start by saying what trauma is, because our current cultural language has included that word in a non-technical way. So, like, I hit my thumb with a hammer and it's traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
Which I get.
Sure.
But that's little t trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm talking about trauma, I'm really talking about big T trauma. That means a situation in which one has witnessed or has experienced their own life being in danger. Typically, we think about these scenarios like someone who's been in a war zone, whether they're a soldier or not,
Mm-hmm.
or someone who's been assaulted in a crime, been in a very serious car accident that's life-threatening, or witnessed something bad happen to someone. I don't have a complaint about using little t trauma in everyday language. I just want to make sure we understand what we're talking about here.
Sure. And a lot of these things are like everything else in life. Some people had worse experiences than others.
Yeah, obviously, if you grew up in a war zone, you had a certain kind of experience that I didn't have because I didn't grow up in a war zone.
Right.
But in general, I prefer not to make comparisons of big T trauma.
Tell me about that.
Because how do you define what's worse? And is there any usefulness in doing that?
So, what is the impact that big T trauma has versus somebody who didn't grow up with it?
Well, developmental trauma, or sometimes it's called complex trauma, which is when you're exposed to trauma over and over and over again, especially during childhood, has a pretty huge impact on people. Oftentimes, obviously everyone's situation is different, so I'm going to speak in generalities, which I don't really like to do, but I'm going to. One of the big impacts is, of course, you may or may not know this, but trauma involves having anxiety. And when you grow up in a scenario where you're having a lot of trauma, big T trauma, you're anxious a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Every day is a day when you wake up and you feel the fear of life. You're anticipating when is the next bad thing going to occur. How is that going to occur? Can I locate where that will occur? Or can I have some control or influence over whether it will occur? And, in many respects, especially children have very little control or influence about what happens in their environment. I mean, just think about normal kids. I mean, somebody else is feeding them, telling them when to go to bed and, when to go to school. And I mean, they have very little control in life, generally speaking.
Yep.
When there's trauma involved, it's even less. So they have a lot of suffering around being able to manage the anxiety, the pain that they feel in their environment that they don't have any real control over. One of the big things that's very common for people who have trauma in their history is that they try to do something to protect themselves from it. In fact, lots of people do lots of different things, but we, sort of the technical language is that we defend ourselves, right? We have defenses, and one of the most common defenses for people who have trauma is something called dissociation. dissociation is the capacity to imagine oneself as somewhere else instead of right here feeling the pain, right? And so, this falls on a continuum where on the lowest end, we all have had some dissociative moments, because if you've ever driven on a long trip somewhere, you remember leaving, you remember arriving, but do you remember the path you took? You were working out the boredom of that the unwanted boredom of that trip by sort of being elsewhere, daydreaming,
zoning out.
That's exactly right. That's on the very low end of the dissociative continuum.
Can I interrupt with a question?
Please.
Because I think it might help our
Sure.
listeners a little bit. Does everybody, do most people, do some people, another generalization question, I know that makes your skin crawl.
Yeah.
Does everybody know if they grew up with trauma, Big T?
No.
It seems like an important point for us to hit that real quick.
The best way to give an example of this is people who grow up in a home where someone is a chronic substance abuser, whether or not there's trauma involved. I'm just saying, sometimes what will happen is those kids will go to someone else's house, and the parents in that house don't say drink or whatever the substance is being used, and they think, well, this is strange. Why aren't my friend's parents drunk?
Mm-hmm.
And then it's sort of like scratching their head, figuring out, oh, wait a minute. Is the environment I'm in
Normal or not normal?
Right. And it's the same phenomenon with trauma, like people who have, like, let's say they have chronic child abuse, right? Like one of the parents is just vicious. They may go somewhere else in life and realize other kids are not being beaten, and think that that's weird,
right,
or unusual.
Everybody gets bullied as a kid. Everybody gets, you see what I'm doing?
Yeah.
Well, everybody had
Right,
had tough moments. Everybody got
right,
disciplined.
right.
Everybody got, I think we find ourselves dismissing, and I can't speak for everybody.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be a little bit you here.
Okay.
I think a lot of times people will try to dismiss stuff in their past that could be big T.
Sure, because they don't want it to be big T. They want it to seem normal to them. They don't want the pain that comes from it, which is understandable, but also a kind of fooling oneself, right? A kind of like trick.
So we said at the beginning of the video that we wanted to take a look at trauma.
Yeah.
And kind of how does it impact a relationship,
Relationships.
and
money.
how might it show up in our money?
Yeah. Imagine being in a relationship with someone who has trauma. Imagine what it's like for the person who's married to the person who has trauma. They might be noticing in their partner that their partner's anxious a lot, that they worry about things, that they're anticipating problems, and that they imagine everything is a problem, or what seems like everything is a problem. When something good happens, they sometimes will think, when's the other shoe going to drop? Or they'll think, like money, like, oh, let's say we had a big bonus. Like one of the partners got a big bonus. They'll think it's not enough, or it's going to have to go to something, unexpected and problematic. And so we're not going to be able to use it the way we want. So they begin to predict that the environment is painful and difficult and try to work out how to solve those, but they're never really solving them.
Right.
So if you're the partner who's witnessing that, you're kind of scratching your head after a while thinking, wait, we just
Why can't a good thing be a good thing?
Yeah, we just got a big bonus. Let's go on vacation, or let's save it for retirement or whatever.
So you're talking about a situation where when good things happen, the mood doesn't lighten. In fact, it might even go the other way.
I wouldn't say that's always the case, but it definitely happens. And you can imagine how uncomfortable that is for the person who's has a history of trauma.
I think of the whole there was a generational effect after the Great Depression.
Yes.
That was a big T.
Yeah.
That was a national big
Right.
T.
That's right.
We had soup lines, we had massive unemployment, we had starvation, we had lots of bad stuff
Yeah.
happen to the
Yeah.
country.
Right.
And that took a whole generation of people who didn't want to put their money in banks because they thought they'd lose it all, didn't want to start a business because they figured something terrible was going to happen.
Right.
Um,
Well, my stepdad was born at the end of that. And if you ever went to his house, you would find a pantry full of food that would never be eaten,
mm-hmm.
because you got to have a couple, 3 months worth of food in case something goes wrong.
Right.
You can't count on the grocery store.
Yeah, and we've had a little bit of a, kind of like a secondary wave of that from the
Yeah.
people who came out of 2008, 2008, pretty big
Yes.
financial crisis.
Right.
A lot of people lost jobs. People had homes foreclosed. A lot of our listeners will have grown up in families that struggled during 2008.
Yeah.
Maybe they were in college, or maybe they were in high school or junior high during that 2008 period, and they watched their parents move from a position of everything's going to be fine to we don't
Not
think
so much.
everything isn't fine,
Right.
and some bad things are happening, and those children have, as I get to deal with some of them,
Sure.
there are some medium-sized T's that
Yes.
have come out of that.
Right. Yeah, and I think, our conversation today is about what should we do with that.
Right.
Like once you sort of recognize that there's trauma in the relationship, of course, first things first. If you have trauma in your history and you're not in therapy, now is the time. Go to therapy.
Okay. So
Um,
say why. Why can't it be that I know that some bad stuff happened to me, and I know that this situation is different now, and
Yeah.
I got over it,
Yeah,
and I don't want to talk about it because it's in the past.
It's a really great question, because not everyone who has trauma has a subsequent problem from it.
Mm-hmm.
So there will be a group of people who had horrible experiences at some point in their life who really don't need to go to therapy. I'm talking about the people who are suffering now because of what happened to them when they were younger. That might be 10 years ago or 5 years ago or a year ago, or it might be 20 years ago. I'm not favoring a certain timeline. So the reason that, I'm suggesting that people go to therapy is because it's very, very helpful to be able to talk through that, so that you're not having the here and now problems of feeling anxious all the time. And, specifically, we're talking about the dollars in a relationship. And if your partner is frustrated with you because you never feel secure
Mm-hmm.
financially, and they're saying, I'm frustrated with you, this is another reason, right, that there's certain aspects of trauma that impact a relationship. And money can definitely be a spot where it can have a big impact, especially around the sense that things are scarce, or
Mhm.
that you're never going to be secure. There is no security.
Mm-hmm.
If you're feeling like that and you've had trauma in your history, it's time to go talk to somebody about it, and, let them help you with it. So, what can our listeners be doing now with, if they've sort of identified that perhaps one person in the relationship has some trauma, what can they be doing? I mean, first things first, I think it's incredibly important that the partner who does not have trauma, assuming that's the case, is very empathic. It can be puzzling and difficult to understand how your partner thinks and feels. And so it's incredibly important to be curious about it and stop thinking that how you think and feel is how they ought to be thinking and feeling.
And we may even, in a lot of these situations, need to move backwards. Because if you've been having arguments over money, let's say for a year or two, and you're listening to this episode and you're saying, man, I keep getting onto my partner because of this, that, and the other, and this episode is making me wonder if maybe there isn't something in their background that is
Yes.
creating this,
Yes.
and all I'm doing is
Telling them to knock it off.
telling them to knock
Right.
it off, and that they need to quit it, and it's creating stress for me.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm adding to the pressure.
I
I'm
think-
adding to the
yes.
anxiety.
Yes.
And now I've got this awareness that, oh, wait a minute, there may be something going on under the surface that A, I don't know about, and B, they may not really recognize.
Well, and if they do recognize it, they may think of it as their solutions. Right? That if you come from a place where suffering is persistent
Mm-hmm.
and intense, then what you do to cope with that are the solutions.
Right. You
So
don't
in
spend
there-
money. You don't,
Right.
you don't
Or
reward
the
yourself.
reverse.
Or you do spend money
Yeah.
and you do reward yourself. Or
Right.
it could be, there's no recipe for how this leaks out.
Right. And you need, to your point, you need, as a partner, you need to know that there's a possibility that something could be going on in the background that you don't see or understand, and that you need to figure out with them, and that they may not see or understand it.
So you're proposing this crazy idea that my spouse had a life before I met them,
Yes.
and that maybe some of the things that happened during that period of time are meaningful in how we relate.
Correct. And you should take them seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah. So back to the point, empathy first.
Mm-hmm.
Empathy first. To your point, try to understand what it is that's going on in their mind, why they think the way they do. And don't imagine that they have all the answers. They may not. So be thinking with curiosity about what could be going on.
Mm-hmm.
And just because you think you've come up with a great idea that sort of gives some kind of answer to why they do what they do, don't imagine that you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Good to be creative
Yep.
and curious, but hold your hypotheses lightly. Let them give you the information if they think it's correct or not.
We've talked about this before. It's one of the coolest things that I think you can do in a relationship, whether it be on date night or otherwise, is when you have time together, go through old pictures
Mm-hmm.
of, when each other were kids,
Yeah.
and tell the stories
Yeah.
around those things,
Yeah.
and explore how each of you was raised. I mean, maybe you get to spend time with your in-laws, maybe you don't,
Yeah.
but there's a lot that went into creating this person that you are now paired with.
Yeah.
And
I really love this idea. Maybe this could be the third one in our little list here,
Mhm.
is ask questions. And ask questions, with an open heart
Mhm.
and without any agenda except for to hear what's really going on inside them about their memories and their feelings and stuff like that.
Mhm.
My wife and I have been married more than 30 years, and I still love these questions, and I still find out things I didn't know before.
Mhm.
So, Richie and I've been married longer than I was single.
Right.
So there's a ton of material.
I'm
to
always
learn.
amazed when people say, we used to go out on date nights, but we just didn't really have anything to talk about. And I'm like, really?
Yeah.
There's bazillion. I mean,
Bazillion.
there's everything that happened before you came together. And there's B, all the things that are happening when you're not together
Right.
currently.
Right.
And then there's C, all the things that you really hope will happen because you're together.
Yes.
That was a pretty good list that I just came up with.
It's good. Yeah. Good job.
So, be creative about how you ask questions before you go out on a date together. Think about, what do I want to talk about?
Yeah.
What would be a good place to explore?
Yeah. And I think I would sort of wrap up this episode by saying maybe the fourth thing is, working overtime towards the goal you and I have been talking about probably in every episode, which
Mhm.
is how do you get on the same page? And I mean that broadly, but also financially.
Mhm.
Having common values, shared values, is a really important part of trying to create something together. And I think there's something really valuable about working with your partner, especially on something you have in common and you both wish for, in terms of how I want to build my life together. Right?
Absolutely.
So I think this is relevant, totally relevant to folks who have a trauma history, because they need something to hope for.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a hard thing sometimes for people who had no hope,
Mm-hmm.
right? To hope for something. So building something that has embedded in it, implicit hope is really important.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Jeff.
Sure thing. See you next time.
Okay.